Hey gang, today we're going to be talking about dashboard design. If you look at probably most of the applications that you used when you were doing all of your trial runs of health related apps, you probably notice a lot of them have what we call dashboards, which is some kind of graphical display to show progress. And I mean, one of the key reasons that we have these graphical displays in these health apps is kind of tied into what we were talking about before spring break. It's all tied into the idea that progress is really slow, and so you need to show users visual feedback so they can see how they're progressing. And before we get into the specifics of dashboard design for health applications, I think it's useful to just look at dashboard design as a whole. And dashboard design is kind of a subset of what we call data visualization. So visualizing complex data in a way that people can understand very quickly. And if we're going to look at data visualization, the best place to start is with this guy, Edward Tufte. Well, that's not him. That's a book that he wrote. But Edward Tufte is kind of the grandfather of data visualization, huge influential thinker and designer inside of this space. And this book, The Visual Display of Quantitative Information, is kind of one of the hallmarks, kind of one of the sacred texts of data visualization. And in it, he talks about this book, or this graphic, that he calls the best statistical graphic ever drawn. So what I want to do today is look at not just good statistical graphics or good data visualization or good dashboard design, which are all kind of related. But what I want to look at is the very best statistical graphic as identified by the very best researcher in this stuff. And so let's take a look at it. This is a graphic that by a guy named Menard that shows the march of Napoleon's army on the left-hand side over to Moscow. So let's just walk through it and see why it's such a great graphic. So it starts out here. The brown line, the width of it, is the size of Napoleon's army when he's leaving. And so you can see on the left-hand side that he starts with a lot of dudes. And by the time he gets to Moscow, he has very few dudes. And then the black line is the retreat from Moscow. And as they go along this retreat, you can see certain things stand out. For instance, here, as they cross a river, the army gets really small. And really the idea is by the time Napoleon's army gets back home, they went from this really wide brown army to this little teeny sliver of an army. So let's zoom into this graphic and walk through the whole thing. So again, we're starting here, we're leaving. And you can see that the army does a couple different things. So you can see on the left-hand side there, the army splits off into a little separate little group. And so that decreases the amount, and they rejoin the retreating army, the black line, it bumps it out. But this graphic is overlaid on a map. And so you can see there's some key locations and that sort of thing. You can see as they're crossing rivers and whatnot, the army gets smaller. By the time they get to Moscow, they're ready to retreat. It's a pretty scary difference between those two. But let's look back at Moscow. During the retreat, this graphic doesn't just show the geographic layout, but also down here below shows both the geographic relationship of things, which is the bars over on a map, but then along the bottom is the temperature of the retreat. And you can see whenever there's huge dips in temperature, there's huge drops in the size of the army. People are just dying because it's just so cold. And again, you can see that the splintered group rejoins, and everything looks good until they do two things. They both cross river at the same time the temperature drops, so that they're barely anything by the time they get home. And the punchline of this graphic is don't try to invade Moscow in the winter. But think about how much information is being conveyed in this one singular graphic. You have the spatial relationship between everything, the map. You have the size of the army, both on the offensive and on the retreat. You have temperature. And you have kind of relationships as the army grows and shrinks, depending on if people join or leave. Incredibly powerful graphic. Let's look at another graphic that's really kind of in the history of statistical graphic or data display that's really influential. And it's a graphic by a guy named John Snow. No, not this John Snow, but this John Snow. So in London, a few centuries ago, there was a huge outbreak and people were dying all over the place and no one really knew quite why. They looked at a whole bunch of different things. Kind of one of the rating theories was if you walked through a graveyard, that you kind of breathed some kind of gas that was going to kill you and that sort of thing. Well, John Snow had this idea, well, what if we took the data that we had, and instead of just simply looking at graphs of deaths and things like that, we looked at graphs of deaths in relationship to geography. And so what he did is he went door to door in a neighborhood, knocking on doors and said, hey, how many people are sick in this house? And then map that as bar graphs onto a map. And so let's zoom in here. And you can see that along the central street there, there's a handful of different bar graphs indicating how many people were sick in that home. And you can also see there's some outliers, some weird things inside of that. So for instance, on here is a jail, and there's very few deaths at the jail. You can also see that around a distillery, there were a huge drop in deaths around the distillery. And so you start to wonder, like, what's up with that? Why is that? But you can definitely see a concentration of mortality right here. And as you radiate out from that area, you see less and less deaths. And if you know anything about probably social studies when you were a kid, you know that this is from the cholera epidemic. And it was identified that right dead center in that bullseye is this, which is a water pump. And what was happening was cholera was being spread at that water pump. Removing the handle from the water pump led to a dramatic reversal in the cholera outbreak. And things like the jail and the distillery are outliers because the jail actually had its own water pump. And the distillery was relevant because, well, if you worked at the distillery, you were given alcohol as part of your payment. And so the people that worked there just simply didn't drink water from the water pump. They just drank the alcohol they were given, and so they survived. And so this data display, Snow took it to the powers that be, showed them the map, and they decided to take that handle off the water pump, and the rest is history. Huge, huge, huge influential data display shows that by having the proper information conveyed in the proper way, people can make rational choices that lead to saving lives. And, you know, when we look at these things, a lot of us don't think of these as design, but they really are design, especially if we look at our definition of design, like this one from Steve Jobs, that I think is the real definition of design, where it's not just about making things pretty, but it's about helping people think or work or accomplish a goal. Or in another way of saying it for data display is this: the purpose of data visualization is not to be pretty. The purpose is insight, the aha moment. And that aha moment can come from a couple of different ways in thinking about relationships of information. One is thinking about the relationship of information over time. Another is thinking about the spatial relationship or relationships of things in relationship to one another. And another is thinking about in relationship to space. So let's look at some classical examples of relationships of time, relationships among elements, and relationship among space, and then look at some contemporary examples as well. So this is probably one of the first timelines that we have record of. This is from a guy named Priestley from 1765, and it shows an example of different historical figures in the field of optics, and their lifespans are indicated by the width of the black lines, and then their names are written above it. Where there's some unknown about their birth or death, there's little dotted lines. And it moves from left to right, with the earliest being on the left and the most recent being on the right. When we look at timelines like these, we think like, of course that's how it was. But no one had thought about this before Priestley, about showing time like this. What's cool is that we move into the present. We don't just have to be thinking about static displays like this, but we can think about an interface layer as well, interaction on top of it. In the interface effect, the author writes, interfaces are autonomous zones of activity, processes that affect a result. And so if we're going to take information and add insight, like John Snow added, we can also now add an interface layer on top of it. And so things get really insightful. So for instance, if we're talking about time, this is GarageBand, where you can see for left-hand side is the past, the right-hand side is the future, and you can see notes and instrumentation and that sort of thing. It's timeline plus interface to create. All right, so that's relationships of time. can also look at relationships among other things. So high density information display like Menards that we looked at is relationship of temperature, relation of geography, and how those things impact, and things like rivers. Now those things impact the size of the army. That's all relationships among different data display, different types of data. Moving into contemporary ways of looking at things from an interface standpoint, this is an application called MusicBox. And what MusicBox did, the designer of this took thousands of songs and analyzed their data and graphed them in relationship to each other. So you can see here are different types of music, and then they're in relationship to each other from tempo, loudness, etc. And you can see right out of the gate certain clusters. So for instance, rock in the teal color is kind of all clustered around each other. They all share similar musical qualities. And on the right hand side is classical music, purple. But what if we were to add an interface layer to that? And so what MusicBox does is it doesn't just have you start with kind of one song, but what you can do is, this is a really cool feature. You can drag a line from left to right or from however you want, and what it'll do over this entire sea of different songs and different genres, and it'll craft a playlist for you. So you can move smoothly from classical music all the way up to Wu-Tang Clan, just where each song sounds like similar to the previous one from an acoustical modeling standpoint, but you're moving over time from something you would normally think is not very related to something that's totally different. So that's relationships of a whole bunch of different data display. Just like Menards was geography plus temperature plus size of army. This is things like volume, tempo, other acoustical qualities, and that sort of thing, all displayed together, and you can get a sense of how these songs relate to each other and genres relate to each other. All right, let's look at the third one, which is relationships of space. This is one of the first data displays that uses geography plus other data. So this is by a guy named Edmund Halley, also the guy that discovered Halley's Comet. What he did was he took a map of the world and it overlaid trade winds, so you can see how the winds are impacted trade routes. The direction and the strength of the wind are indicated by the length and direction of the tick on the map. Now, taking data and overlaid it into spatial relationships has been kind of augmented today. So here's a couple examples. So for instance, this is from a real estate website that lets you see crime relationships over time in space, or commute. So for instance, you can see here in the center is a home you might be considering to buy, and you can see how long it takes to drive to all these other locations. It may be your job. Or the same tool lets you look at school systems and average home value. Or let's look at Kayak, one of my favorite travel websites. You can say, hey, I want to leave from this location, and it shows you all the different prices to go to different places in the world. That's taking data display that would normally be a table of information, like, hey, if you want to leave from CVG, this is how much it costs to get to London, da-da-da-da-da. Instead, by showing it on a map, you can get a sense of, oh, if I fly into London, that's a little bit cheaper than flying into Paris, and so I can fly into London and then have a little trip over to Paris through the Channel, etc. So that's the big idea around data visualization and the different types of relationships that you can capture in both relationships of time, relationships of data itself, and relationships of space. What we'll look at in our next lecture is how do you take those things and condense them into single dashboard displays. So we'll look at dashboard design next and the qualities of good dashboard displays, and then we'll wrap it all up with applying it to how do we start considering these things in relationship to Project 3.